Hello everyone, thank you for your interest in our topic. I'm Travis West.
And I'm Sam Reid.
And we hope you can get something useful from our presentation today. We are going to present an exploratory study which we conducted on the topic of critical thinking. In this presentation, we'll briefly discuss some approaches to critical thinking and specify the approach we take. We'll also talk about the difficulties of measuring critical thinking, and especially in studies which focus on speaking. Then we'll go over how we did the research using a learner corpus of spoken discourse. We have tried to measure the level of critical thinking displayed when students had no explicit training in critical thinking. After this, we'll go into how our study can inform teaching. First, Sam will talk about what critical thinking is.
There isn't an accepted standard definition of critical thinking. So, for some context, we'll look at 4 perspectives on it. One difference is the approaches among 3 disciplines that are concerned with critical thinking. Another is what a critical thinker is or does. This one is about whether critical thinking is a general skill or differs according to the topic you're thinking about. And finally, sometimes critical is used to describe an engaged way of thinking, and sometimes is an adjective denoting a more politically oriented approach. The idea for this research was an observation that both of us made while teaching a discussion course. One thing that stuck out for us was that students often seem to answer a question with reference to their personal situation. So, when discussing a question that applies to everyone, they'd give a reason that only applied to them. For example, if discussing should university students be independent, they'd say something like, no, because I like living with my parents. For us, it really stuck out as strange to answer in this fashion because it seems so easily refutable and non-academic. We wanted to contrast this subjective approach with a more critical form of thinking, which we termed objective argumentation. On screen are some definitions of critical thinking which support this idea of an appeal to objectivity. With this definition in mind, we then had to decide how to measure it. There are a few important points about measuring critical thinking in a second language. Most work on measuring critical thinking in a second language has focused on writing, presumably because the recorded form is easier, and maybe because the necessary reflection and extended format of writing lends itself to critical thinking. It's also harder to display critical thinking in a second language, obviously. And tests designed for native speakers are not really appropriate for L2 speakers. We need to acknowledge why critical thinking in another language is hard. So, students may not have adequate L2 ability. Language use takes up the working memory necessary for critical thinking. Students may not be familiar with the kind of detailed topics that lend themselves to critical thinking, and they may not have had much practice of critical thinking. Now, let's get on to the research questions. Travis is going to take over now.
In conducting our study, we focused the research on 2 questions. Our aim was to observe critical thinking in spoken discourse, and to examine factors which might affect the use of critical thinking in an academic setting. Our research is exploratory, since no critical thinking treatment was implemented during the study. Next, I'm going to talk about our research setting. This study was conducted at a university in Tokyo. The data was collected in a mandatory program for all first-year students called the English Discussion class. One of the unique features of this class is the relatively small class size and the use of a unified curriculum used by all students at the university. This curriculum exposes students to speaking skills which students use while participating in a 16-minute group discussion on academic topics. This setting provided specific advantages for our exploratory study. First, the curriculum for the English discussion course did not include explicit instruction on critical thinking. This lack of prior critical thinking input allows us to focus on areas where it might be improved. Second, previous instructors in the course developed an extensive corpus of spoken discourse recorded during 16-minute group discussions. This proved to be a huge advantage since, as we have stated, current research on critical thinking lacks a focus on spoken discourse. Here are the details of the corpus. Although the corpus is not large relative to full-scale corpus studies, the data was sufficient to conduct our study. In order to use the corpus for our study, a system of codes was developed for use during Corpus Annotation. 4 codes were used in total. Initially, these codes included 6 argument categories. To test the effectiveness of the annotation codes, we ran a pilot study in which 2 researchers separately annotated a section of the corpus. To identify arguments in the corpus, we initially used criteria developed by Stapleton. However, it was determined that these criteria were not detailed enough. So we turned to Ramage et al., which provides a more detailed breakdown of argumentative structure. The pilot garnered some interesting results, the first of which was that the concurrence of subjective and objective tagging in the corpus was appropriate. However, the same could not be said for the occurrence of argument type identification. There were also issues with clearly identifying arguments in the discourse, either due to ambiguity or lack of identifiable language. As a result of the pilot study, 4 coding rules were developed. These rules allowed the researchers to more accurately identify occurrences of critical thinking and led to a higher rate of concurrence in the annotation. It was determined that an overabundance of argument categories may have been a contributing factor which led to the lack of concurrence in argument type identification. We were able to reduce the 6 original argument type categories down to 4, 2 for objective reasoning and 2 for subjective reasoning. Next, I will provide examples of each category taken from the corpus. Here is an example of objective argument category 1. And objective argument category 2. This category represents the most abundant category in our study, with 253 occurrences found in the corpus. Here are two examples of discourse which illustrate subjective argument category 1. And finally, subjective argument category 2. This argument type was the least abundant, occurring only a few times in the corpus. This table represents the quantitative results of the study. In total, 16 different questions discussed by students were identified in the corpus. Students were found to have used either objective or subjective argumentation a total of 453 times. There were more instances of objective argumentation identified in the corpus than subjective argumentation. The overall percentages of argumentation type show a roughly 70% to 30% split in the data. However, as Sam will discuss in the next section, this 70 to 30% pattern does not hold when considering individual questions discussed in the corpus. In what follows, Sam is going to discuss the possible implications of our research.
Now, the students in our corpus didn't have any guidance on using critical thinking, so this allows us to focus on areas where it might be improved. In our corpus, the students weren't under any obligation to produce an objective answer. One simple thing to do is to make students aware of what constitutes objective and subjective. For example, here's a subjective instance from the corpus. And it can be contrasted with an objective instance like this. Here's another subjective example. To contrast with so this is basically awareness raising. In addition, looking through the corpus, there were a lot of times when students could easily rephrase their arguments to make them more generally applicable. For example, this has objective argumentation in red and subjective argumentation in blue. It could easily be changed to be more objective. Here's another example. Again, red is objective and blue is subjective. And a simple change. So, an awareness of pronoun use would be helpful. This is easily practiced. Another thing that affected the frequency of critical thinking was question wording. We're going to show you a breakdown of the question prompts that had more than 10 instances of reasoning. Here they are, organised into 3 groups. The table shows the percentages of objective and subjective, in descending order from the most subjective answers. is where the student is addressed personally. Red is where the student is a member of the group addressed, but this group is not universal. And yellow is a universal question not specific to the individual student. As you can see, the question wording seems to influence the level of subjective or objective reasoning. As we mentioned before, one potential difficulty is a lack of topic knowledge. Lack of knowledge encourages reliance on personal experience. Importantly, students on this program do a reading on the topic before class, take a quiz about the reading, and do a preparation activity before discussions, so they are given some chance to think. Despite this, there was still a lot of fairly simple reasoning, so we would say this underscores just how much time students need in order to say something of substance. And finally, there are a couple of important limitations that we want to acknowledge. L2 ability and topic knowledge have been linked with critical thinking display, but unfortunately we didn't have enough information to include the effective student level in the analysis. Also, there were coding difficulties. Although this is intrinsic to any measurement of critical thinking, it's particularly acute with lower level students who may not have the fluency to express ideas so cohesively. So now Travis is going to wrap up.
To summarize, our study set out to explore the level of critical thinking skills displayed by students at a university in Japan, in a setting in which no explicit training in critical thinking was provided. The results of our corpus analysis led to two conclusions. First, students displayed a propensity to use critical thinking skills, which is evidenced by the high frequency of objective answers. But students lacked an awareness of language forms, which could be used to better articulate critical thinking. We have discussed ways in which students' awareness of critical thinking can be raised by providing instruction on language forms specific to critical thinking. Second, we found the correlation between the wording of questions and the frequency of critical thinking in learner output. While this may seem like an intuitive conclusion, our results highlight the importance of question design and curriculum development aimed at encouraging critical thinking. In addition to the results of this study, we have also identified the need for a more comprehensive categorization system for measuring critical thinking in spoken L2 discourse. We hope we have shown that while measuring spoken critical thinking can prove challenging, teachers can make small changes which will have a large impact on students' use of critical thinking skills in the L2 classroom. Thank you for your interest in our study. References are provided on the next two slides.